any questions, any concerns that you guys have before we get into the real agenda? No, quiet. Yes, ma'am.
Going to be a broken record.
Ah, okay.
I'm going to state my concerns about TCE again, which I've been saying at every meeting. I had the opportunity, I went to I went to the UMass AHS conference and had the opportunity to sit in on a session on EJ issues that have to do with environmental as well as other EJ issues. So it was really interesting. And I met Michelle Reed, who is Director of Environmental Justice at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. She gave a really nice presentation on that. And a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, well, I think that the TCE issue that I've been bringing up, which is basically my concern, wearing my hat of public interest on this advisory committee, that there may be a public health risk at some closed sites that had vapor intrusion that were closed for TCE under the higher standards, because we did lower their standards based on good science. We've had the presentations here on that science from Nancy Bettinger and ORS and various other people who did a really nice job of explaining and reviewing the science. So my concern is that I don't see any momentum of addressing these potential health risks. And I spoke to her after the meeting, and she asked her if this could be a potential EJ issue, and she thought it was. So I'm going to follow up with her. But I just wanted to know if the department has had any progress on this issue.
Yes.
Oh, good.
Well, and no. It depends on what you well. The TCE is still a focus for us, as you'll hear again about in a second. The department is actually doing a lot of work with TCE sites. The distinction of whether they are kind of open sites or closed sites, they are, is kind of nebulous. Right now, we're spending a lot of time and resources and staff looking at, managing, overseeing, helping out, assisting. There's a whole bunch of action verbs to use. A lot of time and energy is devoted towards TC sites. We also have other things that we do. There's a lot of time and energy responding to our ER calls. We have a lot of time and energy that are putting into policy development, a lot of time and energy putting into auditing other kinds of sites. So one thing that we are trying to balance is what kind of staff do we have? What are their skills? What are their strengths? What were they hired to do, and what are their responsibilities, and what are the departments and wayside cleanup in particular's overall obligations? That said, we're looking at, we already have screened a bunch of the closed sites to try to identify the prioritization, and what we're trying to do is work out how we can assign resources to do this in a way that is thoughtful, that doesn't take resources away from the other important things that we're doing, that also cover things like EJ issues and public health threats and emergency responses. It can't be a drop everything else and do it. So I think we're making progress in doing that, and I think we have a lot of staff assigned to work on TCE sites. Some of them are old sites, some of them are sites that are current. and we're trying to balance that workload. Moving ahead, yes, I think we're going to be looking more, as we have the time and the resources, looking more towards those sites that we have already screened and identified as higher priority for going back and looking to see if additional work is needed.
Could the department be willing to share with us the universe of screen sites? You can repeat it.
Okay, I'll repeat it. Is the department willing to share the universe of screen sites?
So we know how many there are. What is the magnitude?
The gross numbers, yes.
Yeah.
Certainly, I don't think it would be fair or appropriate, to go into a lot of the details about which sites and where, whether their addresses and stuff like that. But the gross numbers, yep. Do you remember the gross numbers? I think in the Northeast region, John? It was a couple hundred
Yeah.
in the Northeast region.
Yeah, and that was like a little bit half the state.
Yeah, so the bulk of them, as one would expect, would be in the Northeast region. That number is about 200. I think the breakdown for the Western region, Central and Southeast, follow typical trends for those, based on the total number of sites in each of those. But Central and Southeast have somewhat more than Western region.
Well, when you screen the site and have determined that no additional action is necessary, when you screen the site and you determine that no additional action is necessary, because I assume if additional action was necessary, you'd have gotten in touch with the PRP.
They have not.
No,
That's what I'm saying. That has not been done. That's what I am trying
Okay.
to advocate for.
All right.
Has not been done. It's a long time it hasn't.
Well, okay, well, my assumption first was wrong, but I guess then, when you say you can't give details, don't you think it would be helpful for people to know that if their sites have been screened and they kind of, are okay, or that, or not, as opposed to there being continued uncertainty as, people don't know what the status of their sites are, or for, even potential transactions, kind of where it falls into, DEP's thoughts. So the point that you made that you don't think you could share the specifics, maybe. Well, I guess I'm not sure why it can't be shared with the general public. I guess would be the question.
Okay, I think a couple things. First, one of the things that we are struggling with internally is it's not necessarily as simple as telling somebody, oh, your old site has TCE at high levels of the groundwater. Additional work will be needed. Come and tell us about it later. It typically requires more effort, kind of input from the department on it. So one of the things that we were considering and looking at is kind of sending out kind of a mass of letters, informing people that, oh, your closed site has high residual levels of TCE, in certain ranges, and we recommend, we require, I'm not sure exactly what the words would be, and that's one of the issues, and additional work to be done. So one thing that we've been looking at is what is the timing for that? We're not going to send out 200 letters at once, because we can't handle the kind of impact coming back, and not all of them are screened at the same priority. So part of it is the impact it will have on our staff and being able to manage that. Part of it is the having consistency in our expectations for what the results of that will be coming back. What do we require of the PRP? How do we phrase it? Are we invalidating their REOs, for example? Are we questioning them? What happens if they don't do additional work? What does that mean for DEP's obligation to step in and perhaps do the evaluation and take response actions if there are imminent hazards. What is DEP's obligations for doing enforcement actions? All of those are very resource intensive. So we're trying to bite off these as much as we can do while identifying and moving ahead, trying to move ahead on the sites that are more likely to pose an imminent hazard and require additional work. So one thing that certainly would like to kind of hear your opinion on, another way of doing it, perhaps, is to put out a list. Send out those letters, saying, okay, your site has high levels of TCE. DEP's expectation is that you do additional work to confirm or deny that indoor air concentrations do not pose an imminent hazard. And the kind of initial response we had to the idea of doing that kind of en masse is that it would be a bit unwieldy, that the reactions of the PRPs, and we speak about it in terms of PRPs, but a lot of these sites go back to the early 90s. They're fairly old sites. And there may have been several changes of ownership. The people that are working and living there may not realize that they're even sites. So the amount, which is not to say we shouldn't be doing it, but the amount of time and effort that it's going to take to work with people that have kind of that level of knowledge and expectation is much higher. So we're trying to do it, again, as not as one big grand batch, a big initiative, but to pick them off, starting with the ones that we think are higher priority. The question of whether we could send out letters to people that have been screened and ruled out, I don't know whether we would actually. Yes, Matthew?
Paul, I understand what you're saying, and I
Yeah.
think I understand a little bit. I'm not in your shoes of all the administrative and logistical
I'm barely in my
issues. But again, on the one hand, given the risks which the department and public health have explained in great and excruciating detail about very short-term exposures, fetal heart defects, the possible implications, I just pose the question that it may not look very good in the future should some impacts occur that are traced to this, and then someone has to explain, well, we weren't really sure we could assign the people, or we were having, we were having a lot of discussions about how to organize people, while at the same time, on new sites, we were very aggressively having people address this issue. It may be problematic in the future, I think Susan has a point.
Okay, well, I'd like to hear more specifically from the advisory committee members. Your advice. No, I'm looking at all of you. Because this is a basic kind of what should the department do? Right now, what our approach is, while it is at the high on our agenda to deal with these sites, we're spending a lot of time on TCE sites. It is a policy and resource decision about how quickly, how energetically we pursue these, and how quickly, how energetically we dig into these closed sites, and kind of what the result would be if we take different actions, and particularly keeping in mind that we may not have resources, staff to assign, and a lot of this may raise questions that we're going to have trouble addressing. But it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. So where that balance is if we, how quickly, how aggressively does the advisory committee advise us to do that? and kind of in what format, what structure.
I'll pass it around.
Two
this is
thoughts.
a difficult question.
One is the screamers should be handled promptly in light of the health issues that are identified. And that comes in a way back to the question, what does high mean, which you were referencing in your remarks. And so I'm figuring if it's just barely over the new threshold, that doesn't count as high. So that's one thought. I mean, the health issue is paramount. And so that's one thought. The second is recalling how the TCE look back went, which from the private sector perspective was, in a word, let's see, how about problematic? There's also added to your list of challenges the concern about sites never being closed because standards change. And that has other impacts which are not necessarily health related, but certainly very relevant from a commercial sector transaction perspective, site closure perspective, and so that's out there too. But even with that, I think the focus, this is not rocket science in terms of an insight, the focus should be on the sites with the screening numbers.
I'm not going to just say ditto, right? No, I think that's exactly it. I mean, I think we all recognize the resource issues and the potential for a tremendous amount of additional resources that might have to be used. But if in fact, as Susan said and as Matt said, there are real concerns about potential health risks, I think you have no choice but to do something about that. I mean, and then I would say the what you do about it needs to be, no question, thought through very carefully in terms of, because we've talked about this before, right? The language, to whom does the letter go? Is it, you're I'm assuming relying on old data, as you said, so you're making assumptions about conditions that may or may not be accurate. So someone is going to have to go and check on that, whether it's a current owner who may be annoyed, angry, you could go down the line of what the words would be for that new owner receiving such a letter, or does it go to the PRP that was on the list, on the hook, so to speak? And then that creates other issues, obviously, if there have been one or more transactions along the way. So I think it has to be thought through incredibly well and cautiously from a legal perspective, from a technical perspective, but nonetheless, it has to be done, in my view, at least for those, the screamers or those sites that the department feels from a technical basis may very well pose a risk. And somebody needs to know about that, because I agree with Matt that, down the road, not that that's what should be driving the department, but I don't think you want to be in a position where somebody said, yeah, we thought it might be a concern, but we weren't quite ready to deal with it because of a whole host of reasons, all of which are valid. Nonetheless, I just...
Pictures of.
Well, I don't want to go there.
I feel like I should say ditto from Michelle. I mean, I agree with Matt. How far are you along in understanding what the critical sites are at this point? At this point in the screening, do you know what the so-called screamers are? I mean, and I'll give you the microphone back, but I do agree that if you have those identified, you really do have to deal with them sooner rather than later, because we've been talking about how important this is and how short the critical exposure period is for a long time. Sorry.
Sure, and along those lines, I'm just wondering, you've been screening hundreds of sites. It might be good to get that criteria out. What criteria are you using to identify the high priority sites, and get that information out to LSPs? That certainly might be helpful as well.
So one of the points was made that for all of these sites, we're relying on kind of the data that's available in the records, which for most of them is primarily the sites that are probably most problematic are those that close using method 1. So they looked at the old groundwater standards, the GW2 standards for TCE, which were very high, and there was because they met those high standards in GW2, there's little or no soil gas data. There's little or no indoor air data. So, so there is a certain amount of work that would need to be done to go from the elevated levels of TCE that existed back in the past. One question would be, what are the groundwater levels now? And is there a migration pathway? And then what are, if there is, what is the TCE level in the indoor air? So what we would do in the screening criteria is primarily based on what the groundwater concentrations were, historically. To a certain extent, what the use of the property may or may not have been, but again, that use may have changed. So part of that would be updating that to see what may be there. So that it's fairly straightforward, simplistic screening criteria, nothing magical, and based on limited data. So there's really as much uncertainty there as kind of knowledge that there are these screening levels and that there is a vapor intrusion pathway at all. Okay, so the recommendation that I'm hearing is to start work on these screening sites. Not my words, your words. The sites that are of higher priority. Yes, and that's however we do this and whatever pace, triaging has to be done because it just has to be done. So triaging it, making progress on those sites that pose potentially the higher risk. Do it in a sensitive fashion. I think each case may be slightly different because you're going to run into different combinations of sophisticated owner, may or may not have a different PRP, different levels of knowledge about what the data is, different acceptability of us coming in and doing work, or them hiring an LSP to do the work. So to a certain extent, each site is going to be a little make it up as we go along, but I'll take that back.
Paul, you haven't mentioned how large the universe is of these sites. I seem to recall from a previous meeting, maybe around 700. No, maybe I'm thinking of PCE
Just in
contaminated
Northeast.
sites. Pardon me? Just northeast?
There's about 700 closed TCE sites, and of those, there's like 100 that have levels in the groundwater that could be in the. That's the northeast.
Okay. You've already screened a few hundred sites, so the universe is starting to shrink. Maybe by establishing criteria, risk-based triaging it, you can start to knock these sites off one level at a time. And then for the older sites, that's going to take different criteria relative to determine who the owner is at this point in time and what the status is. Perhaps a work group comprised of members of the stakeholder community might facilitate the MassDEP preparing those criteria and moving the process forward. Just another suggestion and thought to consider.
Yeah, I appreciate the offer and the thought of a work group. I think the primary screening criteria, though, is kind of the concentrations in the groundwater, which is fairly straightforward. And to the extent that we've already had staff go through the files, and as Steve said, starting with many hundreds of potential sites, narrowing that down to those that have higher concentrations, and then within that you can look at ones that have higher versus lower within that group. So I think that criteria is pretty straightforward for what poses a potential risk. Okay, so what I'm hearing from the advisory committee is to prioritize it, to start moving on those old sites, making contact with the people that would need to be made contact with, which may be PRPs, which may be the current owners, it may be some combination of them, and to begin that work. That will mean that at some sites DEP will be doing the work because the owner, PRP, whoever is available, is either unable or unwilling. It may be that some will hire LSPs and do that work and kind of document either there is a problem or not a problem, hopefully not a problem for many of them, and the work will be done in a timely fashion. So that's the message I have from the advisory committee, right?
And we'll,
Yes.
and we'll see it on the agenda again in December.
We'll see it on the agenda again many times.
Just also just not to recreate the wheel, this committee had a meeting about a year ago on the same issue. It's been ongoing. And we helped you rewrite a letter that was a form letter that was drafted. Several of us were at that meeting. We also suggested phone calls rather than letters to some of the sites, depending upon the imminent hazard, the potential for imminent hazard. So I would encourage the department to go back and look at that information that we helped you prepare as a starting point. And I'd also just want to reiterate that this needs to be done. If this is a potential imminent hazard at sites in the Commonwealth, we need to address it. It doesn't, I know it's difficult and it's complicated and we might have short resources, but we can't just say we can't address it when there are potential imminent hazards, short-term exposure out there.
Okay, with that, we do want to move on because we're going to talk about TCE now. Okay, and I think, you know, as John and Steve go through this, you know, keep in mind one of the things that we're doing as we look at this work is hopefully taking what we learned here and we'll be applying it as we move ahead in some of these sites that will be coming up.